Welcome to the Explainer. So today we're decoding the environmental impact of the oil and gas industry. But, we aren't looking at this through the lens of activism or politics. Instead, we're looking at it as a financial ledger for the planet. For midstream companies, we're talking the ones managing those massive pipelines and storage tanks. Emissions aren't just some abstract ecological footprint anymore. They are a strict, hard measure of operational efficiency and risk. All right, let's dive right in. To really understand how top financial analysts are evaluating these risks, we're going to ground today's explainer in the official SASB standards. This framework is essentially the universal language for corporate sustainability. It strips away all the guesswork and tells us exactly what metrics actually matter to the market. To demystify this pretty dense framework, we've built a quick 4-part roadmap for us today. First, the climate scorecard. Second, measuring Scope 1 emissions. Third, methane and regulations. And fourth, strategies and targets. Starting with Section 1, the climate scorecard, or as I like to think of it, the corporate climate ledger. Moving right along to Section 2, measuring Scope 1 emissions. This is really all about establishing that initial baseline. Okay, so before a company can even think about improving, they've got to tally up their total physical impact using standardized metrics. The SASB framework points straight to the widely accepted greenhouse gas protocol for this definition, which is Scope 1 emissions. These are the direct physical emissions from the machinery the company actually operates and controls. We're talking about everything from stationary equipment at production facilities and terminals, right down to the mobile tank truck fleets and marine vessels transporting the product. Basically, if the company operates it and it emits gas into the atmosphere, boom, it goes on the ledger. But here's the kicker. Scope 1 isn't just a measure of carbon dioxide. The standard strictly dictates that companies must account for all 7 distinct greenhouse gases covered under the Kyoto Protocol. So we're talking about carbon dioxide and methane, obviously, but also a completely tongue-twisting list of other gases, including nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. When they say gross global emissions, they mean tallying up all 7 of these, no exceptions, before any offsets or carbon credits are even applied. So how in the world do you report on 7 totally different gases in a way that actually makes sense to investors? Well, you use a sort of exchange rate. We convert them all into a single currency, the metric ton of CO₂ equivalent, using a 100-year global warming potential. It is literally the great equalizer of climate accounting. It lets us take something like a marine vessel's exhaust and compare it directly against a pipeline's methane leak, all to create one standardized, understandable number. Which brings us to Section 3, methane and regulations. Time to slice up that emissions pie. Once a midstream company has calculated that massive consolidated Scope 1 number we just talked about, the standard absolutely does not let them stop there. The very first critical question regulators ask is, out of this total footprint, how much is specifically methane? The SASB standards single out methane for a reason. Fugitive methane emissions have emerged as a massive operational, reputational, and regulatory risk. It is highly potent, and tracking it totally separately, that's just non-negotiable for modern financial transparency. So a midstream company actually has to calculate their methane emissions as carbon equivalents, and then divide that by their total gross global Scope 1 emissions. This explicit carve-out gives investors exactly what they want to see, the precise, undeniably clear percentage of the company's footprint that is pure, potent methane. The next slice of the pie? It's all about the law. Companies have to disclose the percentage of their gross global Scope 1 emissions that are covered under strict emissions limiting regulations. The standard names mandatory programs like California Cap and Trade, the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, and the Quebec Cap and Trade System. And a quick note here, the standard strictly excludes voluntary trading systems or rules that are just about reporting. We only care about regulations that actually have teeth. By mapping out the exact footprint covered by those strict regulations against their unregulated emissions, companies completely reveal their direct financial vulnerability. Think about it. If a huge portion of your operations falls under a cap and trade scheme, your bottom line is entirely dependent on your ability to innovate and actually lower those numbers. All right, Section 4, strategies and targets. Let's look at planning for the future. So we've measured the baseline and we understand the risk. Now, how does management actually bring these numbers down? A solid strategy has to address a bunch of varied sources. You've got flared hydrocarbons, combusted emissions from heaters and turbines, and intentional process or vented emissions. But pay really close attention to fugitive emissions. These are the accidental leaks from valves and flanges. The standard specifically points out that these can actually be hunted down and fixed to near zero. Okay, so what actually goes into a credible reduction target? The standard dictates 3 strict steps. First, plant a flag with a base year. That's your starting line against which all progress is going to be measured. Second, define the scope and timeline, meaning what percentage of total emissions does this target even apply to, and when exactly will it be achieved? And third, prove your mechanism. Are you relying on massive, high-tech carbon capture, or are you just doing better leak detection with a guy, a wrench, and a thermal camera? Finally, management must declare if their target is absolute or intensity-based. And this is a massive distinction. Think of it kind of like dieting. An absolute target, that's a hard commitment to lose 20 pounds overall, no matter what. You're aiming for a strict total reduction in metric tons of CO₂-e, regardless of how much the company grows. An intensity-based target, on the other hand, is like committing to eat fewer calories per workout, like emitting less carbon per barrel of oil transported. If they use this intensity-based approach, the standard demands they explicitly state the metric denominator. Let's bring this whole thing home. Why go through all this absolutely meticulous accounting? Because in the midstream oil and gas sector, ecological accounting is financial reality, period. As the SASB standard points out, companies that cost-effectively reduce their emissions through innovative monitoring and fuel efficiency measures, they don't just reduce their compliance costs. They can actually realize massive operational efficiencies. Bringing these numbers down leads directly to a better bottom line. Which leaves us with a final thought to consider. The SASB standards give us an incredibly robust, detailed framework for transparency. But is just accurately measuring every single metric ton of greenhouse gas enough? Or is the true test of a company found in the execution of their strategy and their actual performance against these targets over time? Reporting the data is only step 1. Actually changing the climate narrative and the financial future of the company, well, that's what comes next. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.